Welcome to the Sages Climate Science Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Young, environmental scientist and science communicator. And today we are thinking not necessarily about the physical world, but actually about people, which is an integral part of this planet. We're thinking about communities. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by two fantastic guests on the podcast. The first is Dr. Jennifer Rao-Williams. You are a design fellow in knowledge exchange and impact at the University of Dundee with the project Design Hopes. And that stands for Healthy Organisations in a Place-Based Ecosystem. And that's in Scotland. They have over 12 years experience in policy-related research, predominantly centred around social justice, creating more livable, healthy cities and resilient communities. And they are particularly interested in fostering regenerative practices that can enable pathways towards transformative futures, particularly around aspects of resilience and learning. Your key interests are in knowledge systems practice and learning culture. And you've worked across third, private and public sector to co-develop socially engaged action research to support delivery of innovative projects that address entrenched social challenges in the context of the climate crisis. You hold a PhD in human geography from the University of Dundee, which was collaboratively funded by the Scottish Graduate School of Social Sciences and the Scottish Government Resilient Communities Division. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Laura.
We also have Dr. Mary Abed Al Ahad, who is an associate lecturer in population health and geography at the University of St Andrews. She is leading on environment and health and the qualitative analysis for social scientist modules. And you possess an interdisciplinary knowledge covering the topics of population health, epidemiology, environmental health, geography, sustainable development, migration, family housing, and many other things surrounding social inequalities. And interestingly, you communicated your research on air pollution and health in Scotland to members of the Scottish Parliament in February 2023 as part of Scotland at the Heart event, and you actually won a grant for that research project as well. So it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
We are going to be discussing how climate change interacts with people. And so, Jennifer, maybe if I can start with you, how do environmental issues, maybe climate change in particular, impact people and not just the physical environment?
Yeah, I think in Scotland we can certainly feel already very, very wet summers and increasingly wet winters too. We'll also have in some parts drier parts of Scotland too, which will mean if we are experiencing, wetter conditions, people in certain housing, and in Scotland, like in many parts of the UK, we have populations, households, I think around 90,000 households in Scotland that experience damp and mould in their homes. So if we could imagine, what wetter conditions will do to people in terms of living in not great quality housing, that's one impact, which is environmental, but also connected to some of the social issues that we have. Other impacts look like when we have increased heat stress in our communities, thinking about some of our urban communities, Edinburgh, Glasgow in particular, they'll experience high urban heat island effect, which is where in urban areas it's much warmer than in the rural sections around the cities. And so that will have also health-related impacts, as will having the wetter season. So those are some issues I think that we could expect some impacts to happen to people because of environmental challenges.
I think that is important because often when we think about climate change, maybe with the wet weather, we think about flooding, which is a huge impact, but sometimes that can just be a one-off, as in it happens very quickly and people are impacted for a long time, but actually the event can be quite short. But as you say, there's almost the top approach, which is water seeping through walls and roofs and damp and mould and places that don't have the infrastructure, and we do have housing stock and buildings that are getting older. Mary, for you, what are some of the kind of people impacts that you see when it comes to environmental issues?
Yeah, I would like to reiterate what Jennifer mentioned about experiencing wetter conditions. And for example, in Scotland, people have seen even in the summer, in June and July, it was really raining so heavily. We had tropical type of rain in Scotland, just raining so heavily for short periods of time. And we didn't see that in the previous years. And this is a big example about the impacts of climate change and how it's impacting us. And to reiterate also about the flooding issues. So we had in Scotland also in the winter several storms, big storms coming, and this like also especially like communities who live near the coasts in Scotland, they had like their houses, for example, severely damaged and the rooftops like literally blown away, and then this costs so much money also financially for some families, and especially like the poorer families, they might not afford like to fix those houses, and this might impact their health as well in the long term. So so like for example, I've heard many stories like about like colleagues who lost their rooftops and then they had like to replace them. So this is one of the impacts of climate change. To withdraw about my research about the climate change, I mainly research about air pollution impacts on health, but I guess like it's similar story also to climate change impacts. For example, when you have like heat waves in Scotland, or like floods, or like losing like rooftops of houses and flooding. So for air pollution exposure, it's usually not equal across the communities. So you can see like people who live in more deprived areas, and especially also my research has been showing a tight connection between deprivation and ethnic inequalities as well, because usually based on my research about air pollution exposure, ethnic minorities usually live in more deprived areas, and those more deprived areas are usually have higher concentrations of air pollution. So with respect like to climate change impacts, for example, the impacts of let's say like a very cold winter or very damp winter, they will be the communities who will be exposed mostly to the health impacts from dampness and from like severe cold impacts, because also they cannot, for example, afford to get some heating, which will like reduce the impacts of climate change. So all of these things, we have to take them into consideration as well.
And I think with air pollution as well, Scotland and the UK has a history of where areas of deprivation have built up around pockets of poor air quality. And that's because the Industrial Revolution, we had intense industry and fumes, and the winds blow from west to east, and so it kind of took all the dirty air.
Exactly. This is also what my research has shown. So in some of the articles which I've managed to publish, I've shown like in the maps that air pollution is usually blown toward the east coast. So people were telling me in the conferences, oh, we shouldn't live in the east coast then, because everything is blown there by the wind. So I totally agree with that, Laura.
And it's interesting how history, science, climate, air pollution, it all comes together. But Jennifer, thinking about these impacts you were mentioning, whether it's flooding or heat, are there particular areas in Scotland that people are more at risk from health impacts, but because of climate, based on where they live?
I think as well, building on Mary, your comment there about the geography and the air quality. When we look at the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, we can see it's quite prevalent in cities like Dundee, Glasgow, Edinburgh. It's really high levels of deprivation. And I think linked to that, then this in compounding inequalities, which have been sometimes generational, which will mean that not only are people at risk of environmental issues such as like likelihood of being flooded, but there's also like the social impacts which are long lasting, which I think contribute and increase people's severity to the climate crisis, to environmental issues. So paying attention to those in parts of Scotland. So I wouldn't say that there are certain specific areas. There's certainly communities in Scotland that are well practiced when it comes to responding to crises. So we see that in our flood communities, maybe in the borders or in parts of the East Coast. So Storm Babette was very strong in Angus, and many people lost their homes in that situation. But I think there's something about paying really close attention to the quality of the communities and how able they are to respond to crises, and that links to like their long-standing levels of inequality. And I think when we see these communities in these areas of deprivation, it's things like existing levels of poor health, it's poverty, like long-standing poverty, it's poor housing. All these things contribute to, I think, their experience. But on a global scale, when we look at those that are most disadvantaged, it's typically women and girls who are disproportionately affected by any kinds of environmental and or stress, whether that's a cybersecurity issue or whether it's to do with financial stress. So I would say that that's quite a clear category. Women, girls, disproportionately more affected. But in thinking about the UK context, it will be the most vulnerable. Our elderly population, those that maybe don't have access to digital resources, because so much of our guidance and support is now digital, and indeed it's become like a basic human right to have access to digital resources. And also minoritized groups. So those that are like less represented, those have seldom heard voices, I think, are going to be the ones that will really have the most like acute experience when it comes to the climate crisis.
Jennifer mentioned SIMD, which is Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Mary, could you just maybe explain a little bit of what that is and why we use it?
Yeah, sure. So the Scottish Multiple Deprivation Index, it's usually an index which tries to measure the level of deprivation in a neighborhood or an area, and it's usually composed of 7 domains. So it relies, the 7 domains include education, indicators about education, indicators about income, employment, housing, crime, and accessibility, geographic accessibility to services in the community, also accessibility to training and opportunities, and also health indicators. And all of these indicators, they are measured in a neighborhood or at an area level, for example, census output areas levels, or even municipality levels, to try to see how, like, the communities, whether they have access to these domains or not. And then based on that, they create a score which is formed between 0 and 10. And the more you go toward the 10, the more deprived is the community. And the more you go toward the 0, the less deprived is the community. So it's just a way to quantify the level of deprivation in a specific community in Scotland.
And Mary, your research was looking at that as well, wasn't it? That kind of inequalities. What did you find through your research when it came to how different people are impacted differently?
Yeah, so my research was mainly about air pollution exposure and health, and how this is different by ethnic groups in the UK. So I have found in general that people who belong to an ethnic minority, for example, Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities and also Indian communities, they were on average 5 to 10% more likely to experience poorer health with increased exposure to air pollution, and this include like increased exposure to nitrogen dioxide pollution, sulfur dioxide, and also particulate matter pollution. They were like on average 5 to 10% more likely to report poorer health compared to the British white ethnicity. And this shows like the inequalities with respect to air pollution exposure, which impacts in turn badly on the health of these communities. And also like there was a case study from London. It's not like from Scotland, like it's from more England towards South London. And then that like took really a huge media attention about a girl who was like 6 or 7 years old, I guess. And then like her death from severe asthma was later linked to huge exposure to air pollution beyond the WHO guidelines. And then she belonged to an ethnic minority, and this like shocked the media attention regarding the environmental impacts and how like there is inequalities in environmental impacts and how this impacts the health in turn. So yeah.
And I think actually I remember that case study because I think the little girl's name was Ella. And I remember when you think about air pollution or environmental issues, it can feel quite abstract. You're talking about also something you can't see. Yeah. Often you can't see it. But I think it was such a tragic incident, but actually hearing about a person, a little girl called Ella, and almost getting to know her, it makes it real, actually. But I'm interested, you mentioned a few kind of chemicals and things that are in. Where does air pollution come from? Because in, I guess, Industrial Revolution, we know a lot of that was coal power and very carbon. Dirty, black smoke that was coming up. But today, what are some of the sources of air pollution?
So mostly air pollution, this includes like nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter. They mostly come from the traffic exhaust. That's why like they are more prevalent in busy cities. For example, if we take Scotland, you can see like the high concentration of those pollutants are along the central belt of Scotland. So in major cities like Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen as well, because also in Aberdeen they have some fuel industry there, and this contributes also to much pollution. The other source of pollution other than traffic exhaust include construction, for example, and this is a major source for particulate matter pollution. And then of course you have some industries as well. We still have some industries in certain parts of Scotland, and this mainly contributes the sulfur dioxide pollutant and also particulate matter pollution. And regarding the industries, on the maps which I showed in one of the conferences, there was a really like a red spot like near the Highlands somewhere in Scotland, and then people, why like there is their high level of air pollution, and apparently that was like an energy facility that was closed now. So now it's closed, but like I was plotting the air pollution concentrations from 2009 up to most recently, and then like in that time that industry was there, and this also contributed so much sulfur dioxide pollution. So these are the sources mainly.
And when you talk about particulate matter, what is that? Is that kind of larger things that are floating about in the air? I guess I'm trying to imagine what that is.
They are like really small particles that are liberated. For example, like dust, really like small particles of dust. And like you have mainly two sizes. Mainly those are the most researched ones. And the first one is PM10, and this is particulate matter with diameters of less than 10 micrometers. So it's really small. Tiny, yeah. But there is also a tinier one, which is more research, and this is actually the most dangerous one. It's called PM2.5, and this is particulate matter with diameters of less than 2.5 micrometer. And this really is dangerous because it can really penetrate deeply the respiratory system and reach the alveoli, which are like the small sacs inside our lungs, and this would cause respiratory diseases and even cardiovascular diseases on the long term.
And I think I'm even getting flashbacks now. I'm picturing, when you do stand next to, queues of traffic, you can smell different things. If you walk past a construction site, you can sometimes see the dust that's coming off. And I guess, these are small enough to get into us. And Jennifer, I guess that leads us on to, so thinking about our health in particular, how do environmental issues like air pollution, damp, mold, flooding, how do they impact our health?
So many ways, and it's some really interesting research that's come out recently. I say recently, probably the past 2 years, but looked at, for instance, both those that experience a flood have increased likelihood of then going on to experience a cardiovascular or respiratory disease, and that's like in a window of like 3 to 6 weeks. So our like susceptibility to these diseases is really heightened as a consequence of flooding. And this was a piece of research from Monash University, an Australian researcher, and the reasons for that is partly to do with like the pathogens that are more prevalent in the environment, but also to do with like the reduction in accessing health, the limitations on transportation just because of environments being flooded, thinking about the home, and a similar case to Ella, who experienced really poor air quality, but there was a young child also who lived in really poor quality housing who also died as a consequence of that. And I think that was linked to like a respiratory disease. So we're seeing, many people have effects such as lung disease. It can create neurological challenges, leading in the most severe cases to like premature death. So imagining in Scotland, Shelter Scotland gave evidence not so long ago about the scale of this being around 90,000 households, and that is going to put a big strain on the NHS if you think about having wetter winters and already an underfunded NHS system. Imagining people that may already be experiencing levels of inequality, then you can just imagine the baseline levels of health of people, thinking then about the cost of living crisis and fuel poverty. They're not able to ventilate their property well and all these other things. So it's a compound effect of many things, which I think only widens the inequality gap and those health inequalities for people. So I can imagine those links there with what you were talking about with particulate matter and being exposed to these environments in really high urban areas.
And I think that's the key, is to understand that. And you mentioned, these have impacts on cardiovascular and respiratory. So that's our hearts and breathing, isn't it?
Yeah, so cardiovascular, our heart health, respiratory is our lung health, neurological. So people experiencing depression, as you might, if you live in really unhappy surroundings where day by day you're having to buy new clothes because your clothes are growing mold and all these other things. And all that lack of agency that you might have as a social housing tenant or as a private tenant, because of maybe not great standards or legislation that we might have in the UK that could maybe do with some improvement. So,
and I think this is by far not the worst example, but during Storm Babette, the roof of the tenement building I live in came. Well, everybody experienced leaking, and it's interesting because it's been almost a year since that happened, and we've been on a journey collectively fixing the roof and redecorating and dealing with it. But there was a time where I had this paddling pool out in the middle of my living room, right, collecting all the water that was coming through. And once it got fixed, I still had that thing in the back of my mind every time it was raining really heavily that I thought, is my living room ceiling going to come down again? Yeah. Am I going to see that? And of course, there's that knock-on kind of chronic effect as well, where you do begin to see water damage and damp and mold. And actually, that's not something that happens in an instant. That's something that can gradually happen over time. And I guess, Mary, the mental health side and well-being, I mean, that's probably almost just as important as the physical stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as Jennifer mentioned, so climate change impacts, for example, drought and heat stresses or damp can also impact the mental health of people. And to link that to my research about air pollution, I've also done research about how air pollution might impact the mental health of individuals. And then I found through reading throughout the literature and brainstorming about the topic that actually air pollution and other environmental factors, they can have an impact on the mental health, either directly or indirectly. And the direct impact could be through the physiological impact. So for example, if we take the air pollutants, the same way they can reach deeply the lungs, and then from the lungs they can go to our bloodstream, and this blood will circulate throughout our organs, reaching the blood-brain barrier, and then they can cross from there to the brain and do some neurological damage there. So this is the direct biological impact of air pollution on the mental health. And then once you get some neurological damage, you might experience, for example, some of the mental health impacts like poor cognitive abilities on children. For example, many research has been pointing out that children who live in communities which are highly polluted, they usually struggle academically in their schools. So this could be due to the direct biological impact. However, also air pollution and also other environmental factors related to climate change can impact our mental health indirectly. So for example, some of the air pollutants and also dampness and some of the climate change impacts, they are visible. So you can see them. For air pollution, sometimes, as you mentioned, if you are passing next to a busy road, you can smell all of these fumes. So this is something sensed. And then this will create worrying feelings for the individuals. And then the individuals will start thinking, oh, I'm living in a really polluted region. And this stress and anxiety can lead to mental health issues and to anxiety and depression symptoms as well on the long run. So this is the indirect impact of air pollution and climate change impacts on individuals' mental well-being.
And I think it's hard because There's so much out there now that tells us getting outside, getting active, even if it's just for a short walk, is so beneficial. It gives you fresh air, maybe, but fresh air, you get to see greenery, you get to have some breathing space, get some exercise. But as you say, Mary, but then you step outside and you think, well, I'm surrounded by cars, or there's lots of industry. Actually, there is other impacts, whether it's even just things like litter or, pockets of flooding, or, areas that have been vandalised, parks that don't feel safe. Actually, it makes you then retreat and say, I don't want to go outside anymore. And if I do, I'm worried. And Jennifer, I guess when we think about, on this podcast, we've talked a lot about mitigation and adaptation. And so mitigation meaning, how do we try and stop climate change going as fast as it is and try and reduce our carbon emissions, but also adapt to the changing world that's around us, whether that's flooding, sea level rise, other things. Countries are obviously trying to mitigate, but are there any policies that are particularly being put in place that are also helping communities along with this?
There's a lot of great resources, I think, geared towards a community level, and Adaptation Scotland is a really wonderful place to start with. And the platform that they have is great for different kinds of users, whether you're a community council or whether you're an individual interested in how you might go about creating adaptive change in your community or businesses. So that's probably a really good resource to go to. They have kind of like route maps and templates and downloadable resources. I think it's making it accessible and also giving the showcasing the case studies to show what can be achieved in communities. And I think that's one thing. Ready Scotland, the Scottish Flood Forum, Adaptation Scotland, they do a really good job at showcasing how adaptation works in different communities, different spaces, because I think it is about taking a place-based approach and paying attention to those social dynamics that are happening in a space, in addition to what might be some of the kind of physical hazards, i.e. potential for flooding, and or maybe you live in a part of Scotland which gets cut off because of a landslide, like the area near Rest and Be Thankful, which is often, previously more so, probably cut off. So I think looking at great case studies which are available is probably a really good starting point.
And so thinking about that difference between mitigation and adaptation, in terms of the landscape in Scotland, have we got any sort of policies addressing these?
Yeah, so the newest policy is the Scottish National Adaptation Plan 2024 to 2029, which sets out a comprehensive suite of 200 actions that we can take for managing current and future climate crises, which includes how different sectors like the agriculture and how even our NHS might be working together to support some of the risks that we will see. One of the focuses is in ensuring the NHS's Scotland estate can be prepared and equipped to deal with things like the heat and increasing floods, because we know about the health implications for both of these things. And interestingly, one of the projects that I'm currently working on, Design Hopes, works in collaboration with the NHS Scotland, and that's all about supporting the net zero and beyond transition for our health and social care system. And the reason for that is because if you looked at the health sector globally, it would be considered one of the 5th largest emitters if it was a country.
Wow, okay.
So in terms of, we were just talking about waste, the NHS is the biggest user of single-use plastic, and it's one of the biggest employers. So there's lots of opportunities to be thinking about how we can improve sustainability from a livelihood, and then in our communities as well, because the NHS Scotland is such a huge estate.
And I think that place-based approach is so important, because there is no template that we can just put on to any place because of the geography, the social aspects, everything that you were talking about. And Mary, when it comes to air pollution, have there been any policies implemented, either around the world or here, that are trying to help?
Yeah, so if I want to talk about Scotland specifically, for air pollution, they have been implementing in big cities low emission zones or zero emission zones. For example, in Glasgow and in Dundee now, now also they have some zero emission zones, and this means that like in those zones, like you're not allowed like to contribute so much air pollutants. So like, for example, not use cars or things that emit air pollution to the atmosphere. And these low emission zones have proven actually to be effective. So you can, like now they are collecting data about the air pollution in these zones, and it has been shown that the level of air pollution really is reduced in these zones. And there was a study actually conducted recently by colleagues at the University of Dundee about the impact of low emission zones on the health of children. And they found that it's really helping on improving the health of children and also the physical and mental health of children in Dundee. So it's really effective way, one of the effective governmental ways to control air pollution. Also, like I would like to emphasize about the role of not only policy level but also the non-governmental organizations, and this is with respect also to the inequalities faced with respect to environmental exposures and their impact on health. So I have been interviewed recently by an NGO called Inequality, and they are working on a campaign now which is targeting toward the inequalities in exposure to air pollution by ethnic minorities, and they are trying to emphasize the importance of this topic and to put pressure on the government to establish some policies regarding this. So we'll see like how the campaign proceeds as well.
I think that's great to hear about these different groups working together. Yeah. And you know, the low emission zones, so I'm from Glasgow and I now live in Dundee. So the low emission zones I'm really familiar with because I know the spaces. And I think, you know, as you said, it's trying to take out the most polluting vehicles, and you can even go and put your registration plate in and see it. And I mean, I think it's important to mention that culturally or, you know, societally, these maybe haven't gone down that well. I think there was maybe a bit of confusion, a bit of controversy, and also people had questions about the usefulness. I think they're also not perfect. You know, there's still people that we need to look out for. You know, there's many people who weren't able to afford a new car if they needed to get a new car, or some people that will have been impacted adversely. But I think the key thing is that we do talk about why it's so important to be doing something about air pollution. And I think we're quite lucky because actually there's pockets around the world where air pollution, it's almost like a runaway train. It's so bad. And I was at one of the COP conferences and they had an air pollution exhibition, and they had these big plastic pods that you sort of walked through, and in each one they'd simulated air pollution in different cities. So, you know, one of them was London, one was Delhi, one was maybe, I think it was Hong Kong, and then there was one that was fresh air. It was just simulating good, clean air. And I think as you walked around, it was so powerful to go from one to one and actually feel yourself trying not to breathe, actually, because you could see and feel it. And I think for us here in Scotland, you know, we don't go into Glasgow and Dundee and maybe think and feel any different, but actually knowing that we're kind of helping mitigate, you know, getting on that runaway train of air pollution, I think is really important. And Jennifer, thinking about, you know, we're trying to put in policies, we're trying to make changes. Thinking about communities, we talk about resilience. Maybe you could give a definition of like, what do we mean when we talk about resilience, but also then thinking about communities, how resilient are communities to some of these environmental impacts?
So maybe just a way of explaining community resilience. Resilience comes from kind of ecology in terms of language and description, and it's the way to give a description to a system and the system's ability to withstand a shock. How able is it to absorb that shock and maintain a function? So if you imagine as an individual, if I was experiencing a stress, how capable could I be as an individual to deal with that stress and maintain my day-to-day kind of habits and all the things that make me me? And then bringing that as a bigger scale up to thinking about a community. If a community experiences a stress, how able is that community in functioning and maintaining some level of like equilibrium before it goes into a state of not being able to function? So that's a kind of a really kind of general explanation of what community resilience might be. So and answer your questions about examples of resilience in communities in Scotland. I think there's so many wonderful examples. The Scottish Government has done a really tremendous job in the past 10 plus years of rolling out community emergency plans, which has seen communities kind of get formalised around how they think and approach stresses in their environment. And a lot of that comes from preparing for the unknown. So not necessarily targeting communities that might be at risk of flooding, or might be those communities that are in remote rural areas, but also communities that are in urban areas too. And this is probably thinking about being responding to a crisis, but also thinking about prevention as well. So thinking about some really kind of well evidenced, and some communities that get showcased probably quite a lot. Examples could be from the Scottish borders. So when I was a PhD researcher, I did a project funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which looked at communities that were at flood risk. And during this research project, they actually experienced, I think it was a 1 in 100-year flood, which meant that they were evacuated. But these communities who where they live in these environments are quite well practiced. They're well exercised, and this is, I think, an important feature of resiliency. It's not a state or a destination to get to. It's a process and a practice. So a community will never be fully resilient because it's a constant learning and preparing and updating for any kind of risk that comes their way. So examples of really well showcased communities could look like Peebles or Newcastleton, and these are the kinds of communities that are quite rural. They are maybe not as accessible as more urban areas. Similarly, communities like in Moray are, if you go on Ready Scotland website, you'll see case studies of these communities. So these have really well-established resilience groups, maybe sometimes connecting to existing community councils as well. So I wouldn't like to say that there are any particular more resilient community, and I've learned from doing research in this space that it's sometimes unhelpful to classify communities as being, for instance, climate disadvantaged. But I think there's lots of really good examples of communities that are well connected and have a level of trust and awareness. And there's been things in Scotland that have really helped to support community resiliency. One thing has been community asset registers that have meant that communities get even more formalised and they know about what resources are available to them during a crisis. There's also funding available for communities to kind of get stock, like the things that they might need in case of, for instance, intense snowfall. There's also increased funding available and lots of other kinds of resources that help communities become resilient. One such example is, for instance, the Red Cross. They do some wonderful work with community councils around things like scenario planning, or they might run a tabletop exercise. So there's lots of communities that are going through these kind of preparedness activities to help them become more resilient. So I think there's probably so many great examples happening in Scotland.
And I think that's so helpful actually to picture it in an example, because sometimes these topics can be hard to understand. Even in my own research that I'm doing, I'm interested in different communities that often get missed out. And one group that I'm looking at just now is groups that are kind of transient, move around quite a lot. And one example of that is actually students. I'm a PhD student, so I guess I fall into that category, but you tend to move around quite a bit, maybe, or at least perceived to be. But definitely one barrier is for people who maybe aren't quite rooted into their community, maybe because they've just moved somewhere. And that's not just students who do that. That's people who are seasonal workers. That's people who have come here from elsewhere, moving around. Where would you advise people to maybe start looking if they're thinking, actually, I don't feel embedded into my community, I don't feel part of it yet, for whatever reason? Where would you maybe signpost people to look at in terms of just helping find information about things like flooding or any of these other environmental issues?
Certainly. I think if you are perhaps living in a rural community near water, and even surface water creates flooding, so it might not necessarily be a community near a river, looking at the Scottish Flood Forum, they have a map. They will show you contact details, so all the resources. There's a real emphasis on connectivity, I think, with these platforms. So Scottish Flood Forum is a great place to look. Looking at your community council, finding out who and when they meet. So it's really about finding out who's who. Even going to some of the the large or even the smaller, like third sector organisations in your community. In Dundee, we have the International Women's Centre, and they are very well interconnected. They act as a kind of an interface organisation. So I think looking at charities and looking at maybe community councils and those kinds of groups are really helpful. Facebook is a great place to still get information from, I would say also, and just becoming aware. So already Scotland has it probably still has an X or Twitter, but having the ability to sign up to alerts if you are feeling that you would maybe benefit from that information. So yeah, certainly the digital side, but paying attention to the digital divide for those that don't have access to those resources. It's going along to looking at your community hall if you have that, or if you're a student, maybe going to your inquiry centre. I think students experience probably much better pastoral care than maybe we did like 10 plus years ago, and we'll probably have better well-being focus, which extends to the home life. So I imagine that information should also hopefully come from the university setting as well.
That's really helpful. And Mary, if people are thinking about these issues, would you have any other suggestions for where people get information?
Yeah, I wanted to expand on the students and the community, because I live in St. Andrews, which is mostly like a student community there. So clubs, for example, environmental club, we have one at the University of St. Andrews, and this is really a great source of information about like resilience to environmental disasters, for example, or environmental shocks, but also about to get tips more about sustainability and like how to be sustainable in our living, which in turn like would lead to the mitigation of the impacts of climate change on the long run. So for example, in St. Andrews, we have we have an environmental club, but we have also a great initiative in this regard. It's called The Transition, and it works like it has several projects aiming toward sustainability and reducing the impacts of climate change. And one of these projects, for example, is reusing stuff and recycling. So when students leave the university and the town, they usually leave so many stuff that they don't want, so they drop them in the transition, and then these stuff will be reused by new students coming into the town. So all of this will reduce the waste, and reducing the waste will also mean like less pollution on the long term, and then this would reduce the impacts of climate change. So this is one way also of mitigation.
And I think that is actually helpful, because with all these conversations, we can sometimes get either lost or excited in the adaptation. We think about, well, how do we change the way we live? But actually that mitigation piece is massive, which is we still need to remember that we need to be getting better at not putting so many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And actually stuff is a huge part of that, right? Because you might think, well, what's the big deal about buying a new chair? Well, actually that chair has been this, it's got wood, so it's a tree that had to grow somewhere, and it had to get cut down, it had to be manufactured, made, shipped, packaged, and then of course delivered. And there's so much involved in it. And actually small things like buying secondhand, reusing can make a huge difference globally. But even sustainable initiatives locally, things like just encouraging people to be cycling more than taking the car helps with local air pollution. There's so much stuff. And I guess maybe that's a great place to end actually, is by asking you, either have you got some takeaways that people are not the only ones that need to do changes, right? We need business, we need government. But actually, I love a takeaway at the end of anything. But have you got any takeaways of things people can either do to help with that mitigation, or actually be protecting themselves and being more resilient to some of these things that we've heard?
I would say one takeaway message is that people need to understand that they are like changing agents. So even like really small action, like for example, buying a second-hand chair or a second-hand clothes rather than buying new ones, or like encouraging small businesses, for example, to reduce the waste and all the pollution associated, would have an impact in the future on the climate change. And and it would lead also to more healthy cities and communities, even like very small actions that we take as individuals. And we shouldn't like always blame the government and other stakeholders. I mean, of course, like the governments have like a huge responsibility as well to take like to put policies in place that will mitigate the climate change impacts, but also as individuals we can change things even like at a small scale for the future.
I think just connecting with Mary's comment about governments, I think there's a growing realisation that it's not down to one agency like a government to protect civil society, but it's many agencies to respond to crises. And in order to like help civic society, households, communities, it's down to supporting their skill development, strengthening their awareness through giving templates, sharing practice, sharing stories, but also resourcing people. So if you are somebody that's in fuel poverty, food poverty, you're not going to have the contingency for 3 days of food. And that was pre-COVID. And that's like generational poverty and all these things that are compounding. So I think paying attention to where you are in your context and imagining what would the scenario be like if I couldn't go shopping for 3 days, and just paying attention to how you are currently living and connecting earlier with resources, being prepared in the what if, having a oh no bag if you should need it, knowing who to contact, who's your who in your community, all these things I think it's really helpful to have.
Those were both really helpful, actually. And I think it is just good because with all of what we're talking about on this whole podcast series, it's going to take a lot of people working together to do it, and communities are a part of that. I loved what you said there about who's your who, find your who. And I guess, what role does that play in terms of thinking of community collectively?
I think we saw in the pandemic all kinds of individuals probably created new relationships, whether that was with new platforms or digitally. It was a whole paradigm shift. The way we worked, the way we learned, how we connected, how we bought our food, all changed, and the connectivities, all of those things kind of changed. So I think it's about knowing who's in your who in terms of the local, and maybe what other support services there might be, maybe digitally as well. So finding new ways of just new support systems, I imagine. So in communities, perhaps these are in your immediate circle, but I think it really does help if you can be proactive in finding out and building those relationships. And in Dundee, we're really lucky. We have these community food hubs. It's a university town, so there's already lots of capacity in there, and it's those social connections, but also the resources in those connections. But perhaps if you are somebody in a quieter, maybe more remote rural space, it's finding what's available to you in your immediate space. And if you see a gap, then it's going to platforms like Ready Scotland or like Adaptation Scotland or Scottish Flood Forum and finding out maybe what resources could complement and support you as an individual and or as part of a community. So I guess it's finding the gaps.
And I love that as well, because I'm connected in with Circular Community Scotland, who are a sort of network of circular economy organisations who do things like bike share and repair or furniture upcycling. But the thing that I love about it is, when I went to use the Dundee Tool Library, which is, a place that you can go and borrow tools, you're not just going because it's good to borrow things instead of buy them. You're actually going to get conversation, to meet your community, to help meet new people. And for me, when I just moved to the city, that was so beneficial. And so I think finding organisations who might not be a flooding organisation or, but actually are a community group that you can help get plugged into is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also great just for our endorphins, and you know, that has an impact on our quality of life and our mental health. And
so I think that was a really helpful place to finish our conversation. But thank you so much to Dr. Jennifer Rao-Williams and Dr. Mary Abed Al Ahad for being on this episode of the Sages podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much.